Most people picture cremation as a modern choice, hygienic, practical, personal, a private decision about what happens to the body after death. The truth is something else entirely. For the ancient Hebrews, burning a corpse was the worst fate that could be imposed on a human being. Worse than oblivion, worse than exile, worse than public disgrace. This is the story nobody ever told you. Put it in the perspective of the ancient world. The Egyptians invested fortunes in embalming, removing vital organs one by one, submerging the body in natron for 70 full days, wrapping the corpse in more than 150 meters of linen bandages. Classical Greeks burned their dead on pyres of stacked timber 3 meters high, gathering the ashes in urns painted with mythological scenes. The Romans did exactly the same for more than 400 consecutive years, transforming cremation into a public ritual with processions, wine offerings, and elaborate speeches before the flames. The Mesopotamians alternated between burial and cremation depending on the region. Zoroastrian Persians left corpses exposed on towers of silence to be consumed by birds of prey, considering the earth too sacred to be touched by the impurity of death. Among all these peoples, one small group from the Levant adopted a radically different practice. The Hebrews buried their dead. That was it. No burning, no exposure, no embalming in the Egyptian fashion. And they maintained that custom for more than 3,000 consecutive years, through exile, persecution, diaspora, and modernity. But why specifically them? And why did the burning of a body provoke in them such visceral horror? Think about Abraham's situation when Sarah died in Hebron at the age of 127. The biblical text in Genesis 23 describes in detail something that might seem trivial: the purchase of a burial plot. Abraham was a resident foreigner in Canaan, with no fixed property, no city of his own, no recognized ancestral land. He rises before the Hittites, bows his face to the ground, and asks for a piece of earth, only to bury his wife. Ephron, the owner of the cave of Machpelah, offers the land as a gift. Abraham refuses. He insists on paying 400 shekels of silver, current weight among the merchants. An absurd fortune for that moment, the equivalent by conservative estimates of more than 4.5 kilograms of pure silver. And why pay so much for a cave carved into a hillside? Why not simply burn the body on an improvised pyre, gather the ashes, and move on like any nomad would? The answer is rooted in something that would become the very foundation of all Hebrew faith. For the Hebrews, the human body was not a disposable shell. It was the direct creation of God, shaped from the dust of the earth and animated by the divine breath. The text of Genesis 2, verse 7, records that the Lord formed man from the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life. The body carried the mark of the divine image. To willfully destroy it by fire was equivalent to undoing what God had formed with his own hands. Cremation subverts that logic in a matter of hours. An adult human body, burned at temperatures between 700 and 870 degrees Celsius, is reduced to approximately 2.5 kilograms of calcined fragments in less than 3 hours. What took 6 or 7 decades to form disappears in an interval shorter than a single working day. For the Hebrew mind, this was open violence against the work of the Creator. Burial, by contrast, returned the body slowly to the earth from which it had come. It fulfilled the sentence of Genesis 3, verse 19. For dust you are, and to dust you shall return. But returning to dust through the natural action of time, not through the destructive action of human fire. There was an enormous theological difference between those two forms of return. Follow the pattern of the patriarchs. Sarah buried at Machpelah, Abraham after her in the same tomb, Isaac buried by his sons in that same place, Rebekah too, Leah, Jacob's wife, the same. Jacob, before dying in Egypt at the age of 147, makes Joseph swear that his bones would be carried back to Canaan to be buried with his fathers. He placed no trust in permanent Egyptian embalming. He wanted the dust of the Promised Land. And Joseph repeated the request. Before dying at the age of 110, he made the children of Israel swear that when God brought them out of Egypt, they would carry his bones with them. The text of Exodus 13, verse 19, records Moses fulfilling that promise 400 years later. They walked through the desert, carrying the bones of Joseph for 40 years, through a land that none of that generation, except Joshua and Caleb, would live to see fully conquered. 400 years. Scale that. It is as if someone today, in the present, were fulfilling a promise made at the beginning of the 17th century, before colonial Brazil existed as we know it. And yet, they carried those bones, because the place of burial mattered, because the physical integrity of the body mattered, because burning all of that would have been unthinkable. But the story has deeper layers. Examine the religious context of the region. The Hebrews lived surrounded by peoples whose funerary practice and ritual involved fire in various forms. The Canaanites performed human sacrifices by immolation, especially of children, to the god Moloch. The texts of Leviticus 18 verse 21 and Leviticus 20 verse 2 explicitly prohibit any Israelite from making his son pass through the fire to Molech, under penalty of death by stoning. The burning of human bodies was associated with the most abominable idolatry known throughout the entire ancient Near East. There was no clear separation, in the popular mind, between burning a dead person and burning a living sacrificial victim. Both involved human flesh being consumed by flames. Both provoked the same visceral horror. And then there was the Valley of Hinnom. Located south of Jerusalem, that valley became the stage for atrocious practices during the reigns of idolatrous kings like Ahaz and Manasseh. Children were burned alive on altars dedicated to Molech, as recorded in 2 Kings 16, verse 3, and 2 Kings 21, verse 6. After the reform of King Josiah in the 7th century before Christ, the valley was deliberately desecrated to prevent any future religious use. It became a permanent garbage dump where fire burned continuously to consume the remains of dead animals, the bodies of executed criminals, and the city's refuse. The name of the valley in Hebrew, Gehinnom, evolved phonetically into the word Gehenna, that same word Jesus used to describe the final destiny of the wicked. The eternal fire of Gehenna had a concrete geographical reference, a valley just a few minutes' walk from the walls of Jerusalem, where human bodies were burned as supreme punishment and absolute dishonor. To burn a corpse, therefore, carried the connotation of condemnation, of execution, of something reserved for those who had violated the covenant in an unrecoverable way. Consider the case of Achan. The text of Joshua 7 recounts the episode with brutal detail. After the victory at Jericho, the army of Israel is humiliatingly defeated at the small city of Ai. 36 men die in the flight. Joshua prostrates himself before the ark, tearing his garments and throwing dust on his head. God reveals that a grave transgression has occurred. Someone took objects devoted to destruction and hid them under his tent. Achan is identified by Lot. He confesses. He'd taken a beautiful cloak from Babylon, 200 shekels of silver, and a bar of gold weighing 50 shekels. The punishment was sequential: stoning first, then the burning of the bodies. Achan, his sons, his daughters, his oxen, his donkeys, and his sheep, everything burned and covered with a great heap of stones in the valley of Achor. The cremation here was not a funerary ritual. It was a continuation of the punishment, a permanent mark that this lineage was being erased from the memory of Israel. The burning did not dignify, it annihilated, and the prophet Amos would make this even clearer centuries later. In chapter 2, verse 1, Amos records an indictment against Moab that many read without grasping its absolute gravity. Moab burned the bones of the king of Edom until he reduced them to lime. Edom was the historical enemy of Moab, enemy also of Israel. And yet the prophet declares that this atrocity against a corpse, even an enemy's corpse, was sufficient grounds for divine judgment upon the entire Moabite nation. To burn bones, even of a declared enemy, was a cosmic abomination. Think about that for a moment. Edom was a nation that regularly oppressed the Israelites. Even so, burning the bones of an Edomite king merited explicit prophetic condemnation. The inviolability of the human body, living or dead, was an absolute principle in the Hebrew worldview. But there is one apparently contradictory case, one single case that must be examined with redoubled care. Saul, the first king of Israel. When Saul dies on Mount Gilboa, run through by his own sword to avoid humiliation at the hands of the Philistines, his body and those of his 3 sons are hung on the walls of Beth-shan. The men of Jabesh-Gilead, remembering how Saul had saved them years earlier from a cruel humiliation imposed by the Ammonites, traveled through the night for more than 20 kilometers to recover the corpses. The text of 1 Samuel 31 verse 12 records that they burned the bodies there and then buried the bones under a tamarisk tree in Jabesh, fasting for 7 full days. Why did they burn them? Scholars point to 3 combined factors. First, the bodies were in an advanced state of decomposition after hanging in the sun for several full days. Second, there was a real risk that the Philistines would return to recapture the remains and desecrate them again. Third, the cremation preserved the bones for proper burial, dispensing with the long decomposition process of a primary grave. This was not cremation in the Greek or Roman style. It was an emergency measure to preserve minimal dignity in the face of extreme circumstances. And even so, the bones were buried. They continued to follow the fundamental Hebrew rule. The final destination of the body is the earth, never the air as scattered ashes. The chronicler in 1 Chronicles 10 records the episode again without any approval or praise for the cremation, simply as an accomplished fact, simply as a necessary expedient in an extreme situation. And the archaeological record shows something nobody expected. It confirms the Hebrew obsession with burial with an impressive wealth of detail. Examine the discoveries in Jerusalem, at Akeldama, at Tolpiot, at Sanhedria, in the Kidron Valley, and at dozens of other excavated sites. Hundreds of burial caves have emerged, cut into the limestone bedrock of the region. Each cave followed a recurring architectural pattern, a central chamber with a stone bench, deep lateral niches called kochim, approximately 2 meters in length and 50 centimeters in width. The exact space to accommodate an adult body wrapped in linen cloths. Bodies were placed in those niches during the first stage of burial. They remained there for approximately a full year. Time enough for the flesh to decompose completely, leaving only the clean skeleton. After that period, family members would return to the tomb, carefully collect the bones, and deposit them in small rectangular limestone boxes called ossuaries. Jewish ossuaries have notably standardized dimensions, approximately 60 centimeters in length, space enough to accommodate the femur, the longest bone in the human body, 30 centimeters wide, 25 to 30 centimeters tall. They are carefully crafted objects, often decorated with rosettes, stylized palms, and complex geometric patterns. Some inscriptions have preserved the names of ordinary people and well-known figures. The ossuary, identified as belonging to Caiaphas, possibly the high priest at the trial of Jesus, was found in southern Jerusalem in the year 1990. This 2-stage process, primary burial followed by transfer to an ossuary, lasted approximately from the 2nd century before Christ through the 2nd century after Christ. Nearly 400 years of consistent and extensively documented practice, and in none of the thousands of ossuaries ever found has anything been detected but human bones. No ashes, always bones. The integrity of the bones mattered because it sustained something greater than funerary tradition. It sustained hope. Calculate the magnitude of that conviction. For a faithful Hebrew, the buried body did not represent the absolute end. The prophet Daniel, in chapter 12, verse 2, declared explicitly that many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth will awake, some to everlasting life and others to shame and everlasting contempt. Already in Job 19, verses 25 through 27, the staggering confession emerges that even after the skin is destroyed, yet in his flesh, Job would see God. Ezekiel 37 describes the dramatic vision of a valley of dry bones that come together, receive sinews, receive new flesh, receive skin, and finally the spirit, rising as a resurrected army. Bodily resurrection was a concrete promise, not a poetic metaphor, not an abstract spiritual concept, a body of flesh and bone rising from the physical earth. To burn the body, in popular Hebrew logic, was an act hostile to that hope. It was to preemptively destroy what God had promised to restore. It was a silent declaration of distrust in the power of the Creator to reanimate matter. Later, rabbis would codify this view in extensive commentaries. The Talmud deals exhaustively with funerary obligations, describing the ritual of tahara, the ritual purification of the body before burial. The corpse is washed in a precise sequence, from the upper parts to the lower, from right to left. It is wrapped in a simple white shroud, without pockets, without any distinction between rich and poor. All are equal before death. All return to the earth in exactly the same way. And burial must occur as quickly as possible, ideally within 24 hours of death, in accordance with the directive of Deuteronomy 21, verse 23, which prohibits leaving the body of an executed man hanging overnight, as an unburied corpse defiles the land. The urgency in burying was not primarily related to hygiene. It was related to respect for the body. It was not left exposed. No time was wasted in elaborate rituals. No alternative was substituted for burial. The body was simply returned to the earth with the greatest possible dignity, in the shortest possible time, with the deepest possible reverence. Every detail mattered. Now consider the theological coherence of this complete system. The Hebrews believed that God formed man from dust, that the body carried the divine image, that death temporarily separated the soul from the body, that there would be bodily resurrection at the end of time, that the land of Israel was especially sacred to receive that return, that the burning of the body was historically associated with punishment, idolatry, and curse. Cremation was not merely undesirable, it was theologically impossible to accept, and that conviction crossed centuries without bending. Even through successive exiles, even under Roman occupation, even in the medieval European diaspora, even in the camps of occupied Poland, where the Nazis burned approximately 3 million Jews in crematoria, between 1941 and 1945, the Jewish funerary tradition held. Every surviving community reorganized its cemeteries, rebuilt its Chevra Kadisha, brotherhoods dedicated to dignified burial, and resumed burying its dead as Abraham and Sarah had been buried at Machpelah. For the modern Jewish sensibility, especially after the Holocaust, cremation carries the particular weight of tragedy. To voluntarily burn the body of a loved one is, for many contemporary rabbis, symbolically to repeat what was done to the dead in the extermination camps. But the story does not end with Judaism. The Hebrew funerary tradition directly influenced early Christianity. The first Christians, coming overwhelmingly from Judaism, followed the practice of burial without hesitation. Jesus himself was buried in a tomb hewn from rock, donated by Joseph of Arimathea, a wealthy man who had likely prepared that burial place for himself. The text of John 19 describes the body wrapped in linen with approximately 32 kilograms of myrrh and aloes, in accordance with the Jewish custom of burial among the upper classes. No apostle, no martyr of the first centuries, no known Christian leader until the end of the Middle Ages was intentionally cremated. The Roman catacombs, excavated beneath the city between the 2nd and 5th centuries, sheltered Christians buried in successive niches cut into the volcanic rock. The catacombs of Rome alone are estimated to contain approximately 600 kilometers of tunnels and underground galleries, space enough to hold more than 500,000 individual burials. The Catholic Church maintained formal opposition to cremation until the year 1963, when the Vatican permitted the practice, provided it was not motivated by an explicit denial of the resurrection. Eastern Orthodox churches still prohibit cremation entirely for their baptized faithful. The Hebrew inheritance continues to live, crossing 2,000 years of uninterrupted Christianity. Even in the secular world, cremation only became massively popular from the 19th century onward. Before that, even in Christianized societies, the practice was considered strange, vaguely pagan, associated with the dishonoring of the body or with the public mockery of condemned criminals. It took an entire hygienist movement, compounded by urban pressures in overcrowded cities like London and Paris, to reintroduce cremation as a respectable option in the West. The first documented modern cremation in Western Europe took place in the year 1874 in Dresden, Germany. Before that, for more than 1,500 consecutive years, burial was practically universal among peoples of the Christian tradition. And that universality is traceable directly to the original Hebrew refusal 3,000 years ago. Consider the full cultural impact of all of this. Every traditional Christian cemetery in the world, with its vertical headstones in rows, its family tombs, its reverent silence, is a direct descendant of the cave of Machpelah. Every funeral with a coffin and a burial repeats symbolically what Abraham did for Sarah on that day in Hebron. Every grave opened in the earth fulfills, intentionally or not, the Hebrew theology of the body as dust that will return to dust. 30 centuries from Abraham to today, a single refusal, repeated generation after generation, shaped the funerary practice of nearly half of all humanity. The Hebrews had no opulent temples like those the Egyptians built at Karnak or Luxor. They had no systematic philosophy like that which the Greeks formulated in Athens. They had no invincible armies like those the Romans sent against Gaul or Britain. But they had a conviction about the human body that on its own outlasted empires and consecutive millennia. The body is sacred because it was formed by God. The body will return to earth because that was the sentence pronounced at the beginning. The body will rise again because that was the promise made by the prophets. To burn that structure meant denying all three affirmations simultaneously. And that refusal was not cowardice before death. It was a radical affirmation of life. It was a silent declaration, in each grave opened, that the body mattered too much to be reduced to ashes in a few hours of controlled flame. They buried because they believed. They believed the dust would become body again, that the grave was a temporary bed, not a final destination, that the God who formed Adam from clay could reform Adam from that same clay on some future day that the prophets had glimpsed through visions and dreams. Those patriarchs, laying their wives to rest in limestone caves, purchased at the weight of silver, had no idea what they were founding for the distant future. They did not foresee that their simple refusal to burn bodies would cross through Judaism, found the Christian funerary tradition, sustain opposition to cremation for nearly 2,000 years in the West, and still today shape the intimate choices of billions of people scattered across the entire planet. Every headstone standing in some ordinary cemetery carries, without knowing it, the inheritance of Hebron. Every clod of earth removed to open a grave echoes the gesture of Abraham weighing his 400 shekels of silver before the assembled Hittites. Every word of consolation spoken to a modern mourner rests silently upon the ancient Hebrew hope that the grave is a vestibule, not a conclusion. The theology crossed the centuries disguised as custom. Fire destroys in hours what the earth preserves for centuries, and between those two options, one people chose, 3,000 years ago, the patience of waiting.